there's a lot that's been going on since we last talked. Maybe it's because I'm now have that kind of confirmation bias, or you learn something new and it kind of changes the way that you perceive the world, and certain things get highlighted. And what I've been seeing a lot of since that time over the last 2 months, I've actually been seeing a fair amount of stories about wood prices going up, or maybe that's partially a seasonal thing, or is it only because I talk to you and my conscious experience of life is such that now I'm noticing things more like that? Or have you noticed an uptick as well of those reports in the news?
I think it's a combination of things as well. Part of this is pandemic gave us a slightly different hobbies. So I'm sure the wood and woodworking isn't on a rise, which could be one of the reasons. Again, I'm just speculating on that part. I'm not 100% sure. But yes, the diseases will do things like that, because demand for instance, we do research with walnuts. So there's a disease called 𝕊𝕐𝕗𝐿 disease. And it's a complex disease, which means it involves the host and the vector. And now we have alternative vectors, not just one. We have multiple vectors, insect vectors, that can carry the pathogen, which in this particular case, it's a fungus. And then you have multiple hosts. And in this particular example, also, we have multiple walnut species being susceptible. So walnut is highly prized for its wood and wood quality. It's really heavily used in woodworking, and oftentimes people would invest in walnut orchards as a long-term investment. We're talking 50 and more years, and they use that as a retirement property, actually, because a single good quality walnut tree can be extremely pricey, and they're bred or selected really for straightness of the trunk, for the quality of the wood. So the good quality wood can be expensive. And if people are investing in this over the next 30, 40, 50 years, losing that property is a really big problem. So that is part of the issue we're dealing with. So in this particular disease appeared in the Western US in the late 1990s, early 2000. And then basically in 2010, it appeared in Knoxville, Tennessee. And the eastern border of the Western progression was basically New Mexico. That's as far as it was in New Mexico, Colorado. That was the border of the Western states. And for instance, we know that the pathogen or the beetle cannot fly that far. So this was one of those human-mediated movements. And we talked earlier, I don't know which take was that, about do not move the firewood. And this is a really good example of please do not move the firewood. Because this is how more likely we had multiple introductions multiple times, because both beetle and the pathogen are very genetically diverse, and that indicates more likely that they are introduced to this part of the world, meaning eastern part, that's where I'm at, multiple times on multiple occasions. So that is the interesting part. That's a long answer to your question.
Oh no, the longer the better. It's a fascinating topic, because you have in a given area, you have this host, parasite, insect. You have this kind of ecosystem. This maybe not necessarily symbiotic, but there or I think we kind of talked about the Red Queen effect of the kind of arms race between hosts and parasites, and trees in a local area might develop some defenses to certain whatever it might be in the area, beetles or whatever else. But then you go and you move that species into a whole other area where generations of trees haven't had the chance to adapt to that specific threat, and now this parasite or bacteria or insect or whatever that's gotten really good at having to outwit the defenses of a tree in a given area, and now it's in an area where these trees are defenseless. They have no kind of natural defenses. We kind of had a episode about we had an episode about murder hornets last year, kind of a similar-ish situation going on of these Asian giant hornets where the bees in their native area have this amazing defense that they've evolved over many, many, many generations where the giant Asian hornet will come in, and oftentimes if it goes out and gets its buddies soon enough, it can kill all of the bees, but the bees have adapted this defense where they can swarm the giant Asian hornet and kill it before it has a chance to go out and give up the location of where they're at. And sometimes they get it, sometimes they don't, but it's this arms race that goes back and forth, and then all of a sudden the giant Asian hornet comes to the U.S. in a shipping container or something, and and the bees here are completely defenseless. They don't have they've never seen anything like this. They don't have this mechanism in place to stop the giant Asian hornet from coming over. And then theoretically, this hasn't happened yet. Then this is a great kind of fertile, abundant ground for the giant Asian hornet, and it can explode into this invasive species and really change the ecosystem in a given area. And sort of similar-ish things kind of happen with trees and
absolutely. And it's pretty, like, the whole adaptation as a part of evolution is, I find it extremely fascinating. I think that's where you can nerd out like there is no tomorrow.
For sure.
So similar things happen with, for instance, most people are familiar with dogwoods. Dogwoods are beautiful ornamental trees. They're one of the first bloomers in the eastern United States. They're native here. And there was a pretty devastating disease that wiped off almost all dogwoods. It was called dogwood anthracnose. And actually, that's what I did for my PhD. I did a population genetics of the trees, not the pathogen. And in certain areas, the mortality rate because of this pathogen, which was introduced, actually pathogen from Asia, was almost like 98% mortality rate. So we were pretty fascinated with that. And you were thinking, this is what I usually use with my students. Sometimes it's easier for them to think in terms of humans and animals because plants do not move, and it's really hard to think about plants and pathogens in that way. And I usually tell them, like, if you have only 2% of individuals staying on the island, for us to repopulate that island is going to take some time. Yeah, it's possible, but it's going to be a lot of inbreeding, more likely. It's going to be a few things happening in between, but it's going to take so many generations to get a healthy, new, viable population. So now you're having the same things with trees. You have 98% mortality rate in certain areas because of the pathogen pressure. You're thinking your genetic diversity of the tree is going to be decimated. You only have 2% of this population alive. Again, in certain areas, this is a native tree. The pathogen is introduced. It does not have any enemies. It does not have any biological control. The Kusa dogwood, which is a variety basically of the Asian origin, that's the dogwood that's originated in Asia, is quite tolerant to this disease. It is not affected as much. It does get it, but it's not as deadly. And they were not as affected as native dogwood, which is Cornus Florida. So when we did population study, to my surprise, and it took me 4 years to tell you that, so the genetic diversity is not reduced, actually. And we have 4 genetic clusters of dogwood trees, and they're more or less almost like one really big genetic neighborhood. You have 4 different genetic clusters, but there's quite a bit of gene flow within the eastern population of dogwoods. And that's simply, again, evolution is a beautiful thing. You have birds that consume the seed of dogwoods. And when they do migrations, they stay in the digestive system for at least 24 hours. And as they migrate, they deposit that seed along the way and along the migration route. That was at least our hypothesis. And they collect these seeds from random trees along the way. And more likely, those are survivors. Those are pretty strong trees that were not as affected. And this is how you more likely ended up with a high genetic diversity along the way, and preservation of biodiversity. And even though you had a high mortality, these trees are going to survive no matter how big disease pressure is. I mean, to me, that's pretty absolutely fascinating that that trees are able to respond that way. Or, trees have certain natural defenses. So, for instance, we're working with oaks now, and oaks have tylosis, which, if you think about that, they're almost like balloons. And when the pathogen enters the host system, then they basically use this as a first line of defense, and nothing can go through, including the nutrients as well. And then this is the first line of defense. Also, another line of defense that trees have that's pretty fascinating, it's called hypersensitive response. So when the pathogen, for instance, lands on a leaf, the plant itself induces the cell death of the surrounding cells, so the pathogen cannot spread any further. I mean, think about that as an adaptation. I think it's so beautiful and amazing. So plants and trees in general, they have a variety of ways to protect themselves against different invaders. And they've done this pretty successfully for millions of years. But every now and then you have a system like that, like what you were using, that just overpowers the host defense systems, or the trees weaken because of the climate change and the lack of nutrients and prolonged drought periods. So the tree's already stressed, and we're seeing that quite a bit. And we're seeing the effect more likely of changing in microbial communities as a result of a drought, including coming back to TCD, thousand canker disease. We've seen much bigger progression in the West, where you have arid, dry climates versus the East, where we have a little bit different winters. And so all of that goes back to so many, it's very interconnected, everything from pathogen pressures to climate change to drought conditions to host defenses. You have stressors, and trees can handle so much, just like us. We snap at some point when the stressors become overwhelming. So you can fight certain infections, but at some point the body breaks down if it's too much. So trees are the same.